As you all know, Harris Wilsard won the general election with a very small margery over the Torchies, thus putting the labouring party back into Powell after a large abscess. This he could not have done without span the barking of the trade onions, headed by Frank Cunnings, who now has a safe seat in Nuneaton, thank you, and Frank, only 62, Bowles, who hasn't. Sir Alec doubtless whom was, quote, bitterly disappointed, but managed to keep smirking on his 500,000-acre estate in Scotland with a bit of fishing and that.
And that was the second lesson, according to John Lennon. Once again, he's put on his writer's hat to follow up the success of his first book in his own right with another epic of inconsequence, A Spaniard in the Works, a little work full of pieces of political wisdom, such as you've just heard, and moving poems like The Wumble Log or The Magic Dog.
Whilst all the tower was sleepy, crept a little boy from bed, to feign the wondrous people what lived when they were dead. He packed a little voucher for his dinner neath a tree, perhumps a tiny dwarf or two would share a bite with me. For champ I'll see the Wumbalog, the highly feathered crow, the laughing, leaping Harris Tweed, and good old Uncle Joe. He packed the very trunk case, clean sockers for a week, his book and Denzil for his notes, then out the windy creep. He met him friendly Magic Dog, all black and curlew too, what flew him fast in second class to do what he must do.
Mr. Lennon, your first book was a bestseller, and I shouldn't think there's any doubt this one's going to be too. Do you think that you'd be published were you not a Beatle?
I could probably get published, but, I wouldn't sell as many. I mean, they publish a lot of rubbish anyway, but I wouldn't sell.
Do you think you've got a built-in advantage in being a Beatle? I mean, are you glad about this, or would you rather have earned a reputation as a writer in your own right?
No, I never thought of it. If I hadn't been a Beatle, I just wouldn't have thought of having the stuff published, because I would have been crawling around broke and just writing it and throwing it away. Might have been a beat poet.
How did it come about that you weren't a beat poet and that your first book was published?
Well, some American who shall remain nameless was called Michael Brown. I showed him the stuff and he took it to the publisher and they published it, that was it.
Did you ever think of publishing it under a pseudonym, not as John Lennon?
I thought of that, but what's the use there? Because he took it to the publisher first without telling them who it was, just to see if they would have published it. So that answers your first question as well.
It does indeed, yeah. Living in, the butterfly world of pop as a Beatle, do you find that this undermines people's serious acceptance of you as a writer?
It does, but I didn't really expect them to take me seriously, so, there's nothing to say about that. They do take it more seriously than I thought, so that's good enough for me.
Indeed they do. I mean, the first book was reviewed in the Posh Sundays, and on the other side of the fence, your music's recorded by people like Ella Fitzgerald. Now, this is serious recognition in both areas. Which do you find more satisfying?
Well, the book, really, because it means more to other people that Ella Fitzgerald recorded one of our tunes than it does to us, because the tune is still something that Paul and I have written, so we still have the same faith in it. It just gives other people more faith in the tune.
This book's very similar to the first in being bits and pieces of poems and bits of prose. Do you think you'd ever want to write anything longer, a novel, for example?
Well, I tried, right. The longest thing I've written is in this book. It's one about Sherlock Holmes, and it seemed like a novel to me, but it turned out to be 6 pages. I couldn't do it now. I get fed up, and I didn't know who was... I brought so many characters in, I forgot who they were,
This happens to other writers, too.
Oh, other writers, good.
The pop business is a young man's world. It seems to have an ever-increasingly young audience. Do you think that perhaps writing a book like this, and writing at all, perhaps might be an unconscious attempt to win recognition in the adult world?
No, because I started all this writing long before I was a pop artist, or even a Beatle, or before I had a guitar. So it's nothing to do with that. The guitars came second.
And which comes first?
Well, now the guitars come first, because this is still a hobby, which it always has been.
Are you going on doing it, are you?
I'll go on doing it.
I mean, have you written anything else? Is there anything else coming after this, a third one in the series?
Well, I don't get much time. If I had more time, I'd probably write more. The publisher rang up and said, have you written anything yet? I said, no, I've been writing songs, because I can't do both at once. I've got to concentrate on the book or the songs, so I haven't written anything since this.
We'll look for it, nevertheless, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Welcome to Glass Onion on John Lennon. Delighted to have with me actually the first person to make 3 appearances on Glass Onion. Apart from me, I've made 73 actually. But no, seriously, the first guest to make a third appearance is Eoghan Lyng. How are you doing, mate?
I'm alright. It's quite fitting because we're talking about 3 books. So it's third appearance, 3 books.
Absolutely. There you go. In fact, fourth appearance because you sent a question to that listener questions.
I forgot about that, yeah.
Being brilliantly pedantic. Let's call it like 3.2 appearances, something like that. Anyway, now it's great to have you back. I was going to tell you, I saw a picture of you in Madrid. You remember the mass events that we used to go to? It's from about 2015. I was just thinking how utterly bizarre it was that 3 or 4 years later after that, I had a John Lennon podcast that you were on. And now, like 2 years after that, you're on it for like the third time. So who would have thunk it?
Yes.
Anyway, yeah, the last time you were on, you had just interviewed Pete Best. And since then, all kinds of stuff has been happening. So tell us what's been going on.
Well, I mean, as you very kindly said on one of your shows, I got a book published Christmas 2020. Yeah, just before Christmas. A book on U2. I don't think that's an understatement to say they're Ireland's most successful band. You go anywhere around the world, there's a Bono track playing in the background. Yeah, some nice reviews. There was a 5-star review on Amazon, which was really pleasing. I can't remember the outlet, but I remember one reviewer said that I wrote with an integrity and honesty that matched the band, and you can't get more complimentary than that, so that was a very nice compliment. They're selling it in Waterstones here in Cork, which is the second city in the Republic of Ireland. So, I mean, the best bookshop in the world selling your book. It's pretty cool.
That's his paper copies, real copies out there. Nice one. So you walk into Waterstones and see your... Is your face on it, or is it you two?
Yeah, at the back, yeah.
Oh, excellent.
The picture was one, I took a selfie of myself I took in Valencia, where somehow I had a kind of a Dali-esque mustache. So it's like looking like a fat Dali or something.
At the end today, I'll ask you what else you're up to at the moment. I know you're still writing, aren't you? And you've done a few podcast appearances.
I've done a couple with Tom Hunyadi and Sam Wiles. Tom Hunyadi has Two Legs, which is a Paul McCartney podcast, and Sam Wiles is a Paul McCartney podcast as well. So what am I? And one or two that have nothing to do with the Beatles. Like I appeared on a podcast talking about DC Comics, so Batman and that sort of thing. Yeah, and Ken Michaels invited me onto his show, and I had a very embarrassing one with Pods Like Us, because my landlord had removed the Wi-Fi from my house. So I was going on like a data, so I kept breaking in and out. And like I'm with these guys like Ken Michaels, who's like a god of Beatle radio, and I'm breaking in and out. It was like, oh no.
That was a Christmas thing, wasn't it?
It was a Christmas thing. So I think the host of he's from Northern England, and I'm Irish, and the other 3 guys were American. So I think it was good that we kind of, like, he and I were talking about the Pogues, like, I mean, Fairy Tale of New York, which is a huge hit on this side of the pond, but I don't think it hit off in the US so much. So, like, we were bringing stuff like Shane MacGowan and Greg Lake, and they were going for more like Jackson 5 and more American.
So you talk about Christmas music?
Yeah, at the end we were asked to choose our 5 favourite Christmas songs, so naturally Fairy Tale was number 1, and Greg Lake was probably number 2.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Happy Christmas anyway there?
Yeah, I think Happy Christmas. Wonderful Christmas Time made my top 5.
All right, yeah. I'm not getting into Lennon versus McCartney today. It's just purely friendly.
It was around the time of McCartney 3, so I think everyone was just so buoyed up and excited by McCartney, so there was a bit of extra nostalgia, and I really liked the McCartney 3 album. I don't know if you liked it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's fine. No, I mean, I'd kind of agree it's Beatle level, but still cranking them out, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so the topic for today is pretty much a neglected topic, because after 2.5 years, you can imagine that 2.5 years of one person, you can imagine there's some kind of repetition every now and again, you know, stories and opinions and everything. But the books have hardly been talked about, really. And I think we both read some or all of them recently, and I was just blown away. I thought they were great. I mean, I thought they were great anyway, but they even made me go back to, I listened to a little bit of the audio book of Alice in Wonderland, in fact, and that's been a long time. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you, what are your general reading habits, and what's your history with these 3 John Lennon books?
Well, I read In His Own Right when I was 14. Around that time I was, getting into Python and Milligan, and I felt that Lennon had something that was fairly Python-esque, Milligan-esque, even though he wrote these it was between Milligan and Python. It was sort of that in between, because Milligan had been before and Python was after. And I only read Skywriting very recently, and I'd read A Spaniard in the Works maybe a year or two after I'd read In His Own Right. I didn't think it was as good, perhaps because I was swayed by Lennon saying that he was drinking too much and his heart wasn't really into Spaniard in the Work, and he just gave up on writing. For some reason, especially when you're younger, you can get carried away by what the artists think of their works, which is stupid. Just because an artist doesn't if we went with that, none of us would watch A Clockwork Orange because Kubrick hated that film.
Right, yeah. No, I always think once the work's out there, it's the same as interpreting it as well. I mean, I've read all kinds of meanings into this, and I don't know whether John Lennon meant it. And I think in his case, he had such a quick brain that he probably didn't have time to think about what it meant anyway.
Yeah.
What other stuff do you read? Is there anything similar to that?
Well, I mean, Ireland, we have, our satirists. I mean, Flann O'Brien is a big one. He used many pseudonyms, so if you were reading the Irish Times, you'd know him as Brian O'Neill. But if you knew him as a parodist, you knew him as Miles McGopaleen. And then he used another name, which was Flann O'Brien, which I think is the name he's known by in Britain and America. And he wrote this brilliantly cutting piece called A Swim Two Birds, which is demythologizing everything in Ireland in such a satirical, runaway style. Yeah, I read it when I was 16 and thought this is just weird, and then read it again when I was 23 and was just blown away by the imagery of it all. And of course we have James Joyce. I don't know how au fait you are with Joyce, but I mean, Ulysses is pre-Python at times.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Joyce because I know you've posted that you've read Ulysses a few times. I've been, too afraid to. Not afraid, but when I start a book, I almost have to finish it. I've hardly ever abandoned a book in my life, so if I started, I'd have to finish. So give us just an idea of Joyce, if you don't mind. So
it was actually a uni boast. I was in my second year of uni. I was 19. I liked to, dress in these long coats, scarves, and I'd, pick up copies of Samuel Beckett in French just because, I wanted to appear that kind of lofty way. And I met up with my friend Kate recently, and she remembered the time we were in a lecture, and I asked her to pass me my book, and I had been reading the hard copy of Ulysses, and she just threw it at me saying, "You're such a pretentious fuck, Eoghan." So that was probably the appeal at first, but then the following year I studied it, and then from then I'd just keep nipping in and out of it. But yeah, I love it. I think it's my favourite book. It's Irish, it's bewilderingly intelligent, it seems to have 100 genres in 1,000-page book. I think if you're going to read it, just don't expect to understand it, because Joyce himself deliberately meant for some of it not to be understood.
Oh, okay, right. Is that stream of consciousness, or do you think it's very thought out?
I think it's a combination of both. Weirdly, the book that I think that resembles it the most is actually Alan Moore's Watchmen, where it's just it just takes off in so much, but at the end it all kind of leads to this sort of spiritual conclusion that it doesn't spell out the answers, but it's all led up to this point of genuine satisfaction. Have you read Moore's Watchmen?
No, I haven't.
Okay, it was a graphic novel published in the 80s. Superficially, it's a graphic novel, but it seems to pivot in so many different directions. At one point, it turns into letter writing. Then it's like a serial from the 1920s, and at the same time, it's parodying the comic book genre, which is what Joyce was doing. Which he was parodying certain genres. He was parodying this lofty Irishness. He was parodying the Empire of Britain. He's parodying different perceptions. He's showing the idea of a true Irishman, but his father's Jewish, so does that make him an Irishman? So there's a lot going on. But it's also laced with just tremendous dark humour. There's so much bite in it. Yeah. Endlessly quotable.
Awesome. Yeah, I will get there one day. I'll conquer my fear. We'll talk about influences on John Lennon in a second, but do you see much Joyce in these John Lennon books?
I don't know if he was influenced by Joyce. I see Carol a lot more, as in Lewis. That's probably the number one. I can definitely see the Goon Show in there, people like Sellers and Milligan. Maybe some Irish writers, satirists like Jonathan Swift is Irish, everyone seems to forget that. He wrote Gulliver's Travels, or Daniel Defoe, who wrote some lofty British text but was actually an Irishman and a satirist.
The other ones they talk about, I suppose, I always had to remember that there's also drawings in these books. I always think of them as the writing, and I almost forget the drawings. I think drawing-wise, the ones that John Lennon himself mentioned Ronald Searle, who was a cartoonist. I think he was English, and then Thurber was a New York Times cartoonist as well. And then, of course, there's Stanley Unwin. We can't possibly not mention. And I will play a clip, in fact, right now.
You know, one of the sum it up of this is what Emerson said, that Ulysses knows no remedy save that which or wax or stuffy into the eardroves in order to pass the siren safely. And I think he was twice times 19 for 30 acres when he said that.
Have you heard the Ogden's Nut Gun Flake album by the Small Faces?
Yeah. He's on it.
Yeah, he narrates the story of Oniwini's.
Yeah. I just remembered, actually, the last time you were on, we did 65. I think we did talk briefly about Spaniard in the Works. I haven't listened back to it. I don't listen back to them. I'm afraid to. Best foot forward instead. But, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the background. We're going to do, the background to the first two books, because they kind of followed each other in fairly rapid succession, because I think he wrote most of Spaniard in the Works, in fact, in 64. Buoyed by the success of the first book, they got him to write the second one. So anyway, the big difference between them really is that the first book had almost been written by 64, because it goes back to his school days, the Daily Howl and everything.
Yeah.
Talking very generally, what would you say are the themes of the books, if you just had to give two or three?
There's a strangely political theme to it, like, say, the likes of Cook and Milligan, taking down the hierarchical scheme. There's the New England one that's not, quite so reverential to royalty. And I should probably say now to any potential listeners, I'm not a royalist, so I'm going to forewarn these people. There's that element. Another theme of the book is that it's set in a sort of a pseudo-Victorian land, so the Carolian influence is very apparent. I also think that it's strangely autobiographical at points, because a lot of it seems to reflect on where he was in school and his daily happenings with, say, some of his friends.
Yeah, I've got here anti-authority, hypocrisy. It's quite cynical, but I don't see it as just cynical for the sake of it. I think even at this time, even though he's only in his mid-20s, he's already seen a little bit of life. He's obviously had a lot of tragedy in his life. So there's this strange thing with deformities, which I don't think has ever really been properly explained, but I think all the stuff where he's talking about Jews or blacks or any minorities, I don't think he's prejudiced against them. I think it's more that he's actually just pointing out the fact these prejudices are there. Because the whole irony really, or I don't know if it's an irony, but the whole thing is that Liverpool is traditionally very multicultural because it's a port.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is that the Beatles would have had more access is not the right good word, but exposure to different cultures and minority groups, certainly more than, the home counties or something like that.
Yeah.
So we know that he was writing from a very early age, and he was a huge reader. Like, he learned to read from the Liverpool Echo. His uncle had him reading articles from there at a very, very young age. They were in a literary household. And I guess you're aware that he did some of it went into Merseybeat, Bill Harry's newspaper.
Yeah. There's that story of how the Beatles began because a man came down on a flaming pie.
Absolutely, yeah. On the dubious origins of Beatles. Also, you may know this, but basically Bill Harry read one of John Lennon's poems and said, "Oh, that's really good. Have you got any more?" John Lennon appears with about 250, and then Bill Harry's wife unfortunately threw them out.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, I lost one podcast, and that was bad enough. But 248 or whatever it was pieces. Yeah, John Lennon was in tears. But well, that's the thing, something like this, it's difficult to repeat it. It comes out of his head directly onto the page pretty much. It's difficult to get the inspiration. That's why the second book, as you said, the second book was basically written to order, which doesn't necessarily make it worse, of course. Depends. He did a poem for his school magazine, if you call that being published, I suppose. The Tale of Hermit Fred. He's something about knitting spaghetti apple pie. I peel the bagpipes for my wife and cut all Negro's hair, as breathing is my very life, to stop I do not dare. And there's lots of other examples. Do you know the song You'll Be Mine? You must have heard that from the anthology.
Yeah.
You'll be mine. That one. There's a bit in the middle where John does that spoken bit and he talks about your National Health Eyeball. So it's all there, you know. I wouldn't say he came out fully formed, but he was doing it from a very early age. So could you summarise in his own right, what is it exactly for anyone who's never read it or heard of it?
It's a life collection of satirical vignettes written. I don't know if he was influenced by Peter Cook, but it feels like it's in the school of Cook.
Right. Yeah. And it's generally pretty short. They range from 8 lines to 3 pages, I think. It's all, vignettes is exactly the word.
In Peter Doggett's book, he interviewed it might have been Derek Taylor, but they said that Lennon had basically had no attention span whatsoever.
Yeah, I wonder if later in his life, had he lived past 1980, he might have gone on to something more long form, because Spaniard the Works pieces are longer. Just a little bit of details about the first book. So it's published in March 1964 while they were filming A Hard Day's Night. And of course, the amazing thing is how different it is to the songs that they were doing. And obviously, they were inhabiting 2 completely different worlds. Sold 600,000 copies. According to Mark Lewisohn, I sent you that video. It's a really, really cool video of him talking about the books.
Yeah.
It cost slightly more than a single and much less than an album, so fairly cheap, I'd say. It was translated into several languages, including Russian.
Ooh.
That'd be interesting. Don't know how they do that, but he was obviously dubbed the writing Beetle, the literary Beetle, the clever Beetle, and then it was adapted into a play in 1968, produced by Laurence Olivier and directed by Victor Spinetti. There's all sorts of funny interviews. Have you seen the one where George starts reading it and just tears the book up?
George Harrison. I haven't seen that one, no.
Yeah, very funny. And he said, I don't know what I'd call it. It's just sort of rubbish, really.
Mr. John Lennon. Yeah, we in Stockholm are always very glad to say welcome to a young author from Liverpool. In fact, you are the first author from Liverpool I've ever seen.
Great.
But your first book sold in 350,000 copies and came out this year. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. And tell me, you brought 3 of your friends. Could you please introduce
Yes,
them?
there's George Parasol, Ringo Stone, and Paul Mccartney.
And did they have anything to do with your book? Did they help you or did they hinder you in any way?
No, they typed it out for me.
That's right. I mean, they
Where is
can
she?
spell and you...
Oh, they spell very greatly.
That's nice. By the way, I read a review about it in Times Literary Supplement, and then I read the book. And then I wonder, are you influenced by Thurber or James Joyce?
None of them.
None
James
of them,
Stewart.
no. James Stewart.
James Stewart and
I
Betty
see.
Grable.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I'm quite sure that our Swedish viewers would like to hear you read one of your poems.
Right.
Good.
Good dog, Nigel.
Yeah?
Half he goes, I met his sight, our little hairy friend. Half upon the lamppost bright.
It's all like that.
Half
Look,
in round the bend.
This one's better.
Is that better?
Look.
I think, actually, one thing I will say about George is in the solo years, he might have taken up the mantle of being the clever or the polymathic Beatle, given that, Bangladesh, handmade films, he seemed to have the widest net.
Well, there's a funny thing, yeah. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but, they seem to stop experimenting, almost. He went into films, you're right, but John maybe, I don't know so much about Paul, but John, kind of his music and everything got less experimental. It's almost like that was very much a 60s thing for him. I don't know. I love that clip because at that time, they were friendly enough that George could just rip the book up and John Lennon would get what it meant, and we said, it's rubbish because it's nonsense. It's literally the genre. Nonsense is a genre, isn't it? Yeah, it's not saying that it's actually not good quality, but it's nonsense in the sense of it's gobbledygook.
Well, I mean, there's also... Peter Jackson, not recently, but last year he released a clip from his Get Back project, and it shows John Lennon reading out a tale of Harrison getting arrested. Now, George Harrison on 42 Road, and he's really going for this over-the-top accent.
Maybe parodying Yellow Submarine, I don't know. Talking of George, I think Paul and George may even have contributed a little bit to some of these pieces. Maybe just a word here and there. And there is one in the first book called Henry and Harry, which apparently is somewhat based on George Harrison and his dad, and it's that old parental thing of you need to get a proper job, son, because George Harrison could have been an electrician. He did work as an electrician's apprentice or something.
Did you see that clip of Gay Byrne interviewing the Beatles in 1963, and he unfortunately says, "Now, John and Paul, tell us about your mammies," in that sort of Irish way, and the two guys look at each other going, "Oh, no." And George steps in to give him a nice wave at his mother. Did he really say that? To Byrne's credit, it was 1963, the Beatles were starting, so he probably didn't know about that two of the guys had lost their mums.
Yeah, their biography.
Yeah.
Then we get this idea of Brummer striving, which is about, I think John Lennon made that up, it's about getting a proper job, being in the rat race. And then there's an interesting story called Randolph's Party, which a lot of people think might be based on Pete Best. I think Randolph's actually his real first name.
It is, yeah.
As Paul McCartney's first name is actually James, isn't it? Now, there's a little bit of a misconception. I was always told that John Lennon had written something to do with Pete Best, which is something like, "We never liked you, soft ass," or something like that. "You were never one of us," or something. Yeah. But it turns out it's from this story. He's talking about this Randolph character, and I don't know if it's supposed to be Pete Best, Maybe he just took the name Randolph from Pete Best. It's not clear that it's about him.
I don't think John was that mean-spirited that he would have been so soon after sacking Pete Best that he would have been so publicly.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when, I don't know, if someone goes out of your life, I don't know, to use a modern parlance, you cancel them. But yeah, ironically, they were the best. Well, of course, Owen, because you asked Pete Best, were you closer to John and Paul? And he said John, didn't he?
Yeah, Pete, without hesitating, said John.
Yeah. Now, the books, the reception to the books was mostly positive, I'd say. The most famous one is probably from the Times. "This book is worth the attention of anyone who fears for the impoverishment of the English language and British imagination." It's a great quote. And then on the back of, I think it's one of the later copies, the copy I've got is not an original. "Zany, offbeat and illustrated by his grotesque and spidery pen, it jolts the reader into gusts of laughter, goes down like pure whimsy and back kicks like a sick mule." There you go.
That's a tasty little quote.
Yeah, not bad. The main negative one, I think I played this clip actually in the last show you were on. Charles Curran, a Conservative MP, he reads Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me, which is one of the pieces from the first book. And I'm going to play a clip of what he says now.
"His name is John Lennon, and he's one of the Beatles. I have never seen or heard the Beatles, but I have been very interested indeed to read a book by John Lennon, published in America, and I believe in this country. I would like to quote one of the poems. It is one that the Ministry of Education and Science might well distribute to every member of its staff concerned with the kind of children we are discussing. It is called Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me. I will quote 3 verses from it. "Never shall we partly stray, fast stirrup all we three, fight the battle mighty sword, Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me. Thorg Billy Grows and Burnley 10 and Aston Villa 3, we clobber ever gallop, Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me. So if you hear a wondrous sight, am blutter or at sea, remember whom the mighty say, Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me." I quote that poem not because of its literary merit, but because one can see from it, as from other poems and stories in the book, 2 things about John Lennon. He has a feeling for words and storytelling, and he's in a state of pathetic near-literacy. He seems to have picked up bits of Tennyson, Browning, and Robert Louis Stevenson while listening with one ear to the football results on the wireless.
There seemed to be a thing against of people like Conservative MPs seem to have a disdain for pop culture. They had it in for Ronan O'Reilly in the late 60s when he started Radio Caroline.
I mean, I think in those days as well, I think there was a bit more difference between the 2 parties in England. A lot of people would say it's almost the business party against the business party. Or maybe they say that about America, but yeah, because you could argue this Tory government's gone a bit more extreme to the right. I don't know, but I think in those days there was a huge divide. Whether it was a real divide in the end, whether they have similar interests, who knows. But
yeah, both were determined to keep the empire going, but one was a bit more lenient towards the working classes, and that was the Labour Party. Also, Labour were a bit more amenable to the unification of Ireland than perhaps the Tories were.
So they had some semblance of what you traditionally think of as, left and right, but I don't know what we've got now. Who the hell knows? I got a question for you. Are you surprised maybe that there wasn't more negative reaction when this came out? I'm just going to say, if we compare the Beatles, this might seem an unfortunate comparison to someone like Take That or even the Spice Girls. And let me explain. I don't think in those days people realised how good the songs were. I think they saw them as kind of kids' music and good fun. But do you not think reading the books again that you might have expected a stronger reaction?
I think perhaps it solidified their cachet, that they realised, okay, these guys are actually intelligent. It's a bit like you mentioned bands like Take That. I'm thinking of Harry Styles from One Direction. Like, it's easy to write off One Direction, and then you see him in a film like the Christopher Nolan World War I film that was, about, rescuing Dunkirk. And you realise there's a lot more to him than just being a pretty face.
Yeah. And of course, this was the start of the period of satire. That was a week that was, which was David Frost's programme, which I always find a bit strange because David Frost looked about as little like an anti-establishment sort of rebel as you could get, really. But that was apparently the first time that really politicians had ever been lampooned. Yeah. And now you've got, harassed Will Sod and Priceless Margarine and harassed Macmillan, to name three.
Subtle, eh?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. When I was reading it, I was thinking there's way more to this than meets the eye. That's another line from Help, isn't it? There's more to this than meets the eye.
Never you mind.
Never you mind. Yeah, fuck the books. Let's just do Help.
Okay.
Go on, do one more. Come on.
Peace and love, Beatle fans. All right.
This is the famous Ringo here, Gear Fab. You're not getting anywhere with that, are you, jeweler? Anyway, yeah, the other thing, what happened at the Foyles Literary Luncheon when John Lennon was meant to make a speech?
He goes up, says, thank you very much, and sits down.
Yeah, you've got a lucky face. I think he said that as well.
According to Mark Lewisohn, it's believed that he had a hangover, but Lewisohn said no, he might have been drinking, but what he was doing was, he was parodying this, this idea that you go up and make the greatest speech of your life, and he's just like, he just sits down and says, thanks very much. It was a satirical move.
It's a dig, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I think in Cynthia's book, she said that, yeah, they'd been out drinking the night before. So it's probably like all these things, a bit of a combination of all those things, isn't it? Mm-hmm. There's a really good documentary, actually, that we just talked about on the last show that's not very well known, made by Time Watch, which is like a documentary series in England called Beetle Mania. And they talk about, they used to go to all these sort of fancy parties in swinging London and stuff. And I think it's Chris Hutchins, the journalist, said, they really didn't like it. You couldn't take Liverpool out of the man, so to speak. And there's another famous clip where, you're supposed to say Chief Barker when you make a speech in those days. You say, Chief Barker, Lords, ladies and gentlemen. George Harrison brilliantly said Chief Barker and then said Mr. Dobson, because Barker and Dobson was like a northern make of sweets.
Oh, dear.
Oh, it's brilliant, And then John Lennon said, thanks for the Purple Hearts, which is brilliant because it's both a drugs reference and an anti-war reference at the same time. It was all there, they were doing it from the beginning. We know that now.
Rattle your jewellery and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Rattle your jewellery. Or rattle your fucking jewellery, as the original intention was, apparently. And then you've got these... he was on Not Only But Also. You talked about Peter Cook earlier. Mm-hmm. Norman Rossington was on that as well. I really love those appearances. I think they're brilliant because I think someone like Norman Rossington and definitely Peter Cook and Dudley Moore would have got the humour instantly, wouldn't you say?
For sure.
Finally, the awful himself with The Wrestling Dog.
The Wrestling Dog. Once upon a time in a far-off distant land, far across the sea, miles away from anyway, over the hills as the crow barked. 39 people lived miles away from anywhere on a little island on a distant land. When harvest time came along, all the people celebrated with a mighty feast and dancing and that. It was Perry's.
For Perry was the loud mare.
Job to provide.
At Perry's great pleasure, I might add.
And new and exciting.
And usually it was.
Thrill and spectacular performer.
Sometimes a dwarf was used.
This year Perry had surpassed himself by getting a wrestling dog. But who would fight this wondrous beast? I wouldn't for a kick-off. Won't get me fighting it, Dudley.
Mr. John Lennon will be back with the answers later on in the programme.
There's a tale that one of the prime ministers went to see Cook and Alan Bennett do a skit of him, and they spotted him in the audience. They were parodying him, and they thought, great.
I suppose to his credit, he went to watch it, didn't he? So, yeah. I don't know. I get the feeling, a lot of these politicians, they probably quite enjoy it, but obviously they're not allowed to say so, are they? So. And then one thing that was massively important was he did an interview just after In His Own Right came out with Kenneth Alsop of the BBC, who famously challenged him and said, why don't you put all this wordplay into your songs? Cue a massive change, in John Lennon's writing. But I have a question for you. If you take it In His Own Right and then you take, Lucy, obviously inspired by Lewis Carroll, or I Am the Walrus, there's a period in between those two where you've got stuff like I'm a Loser and In My Life. Now, I don't see any correlation between In His Own Right and In My Life. Is there a connection there, or is it just to do with personalizing in a kind of general way? What do you reckon?
I think In My Life is very much about his life in Liverpool and, some are dead and some are living. He'd lost Stu, he'd lost a couple of people. So that was him like singing from the heart, so I don't think that's one. But they were starting to loosen up by the time of Rubber Soul. They were starting to make things a bit more silly. Norwegian Wood has sort of like literary things going for it. A lot of like literary metaphors. So maybe that might be one.
Yeah, the huge irony of that is, of course, Fourth Time Around was Dylan's take on Norwegian Wood. And I've never got to the bottom of this, but Dylan's version, he's got all these references to I Never Asked for Your Crutch and wheelchairs and things like that. So I don't know whether Dylan was taking Norwegian Wood and John Lennon's books and putting them together in some bizarre way. But it's very ironic that actually John Lennon's songs don't have any, as far as I know, don't have any references to deformities and things like that.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that there's this period where he's personalizing, but it's nothing like the books. And then suddenly you get 67, you've got Walrus, Crabble Like a Fishwife and Elementary Penguin. That seems very similar spirit to these books.
Well, not that I'm advocating the use of LSD, but he and actually Alan Moore, as I mentioned before, both said that they felt like it opened their mind to like newer dimensions and newer forms of art. And by 67, Lennon's not hiding his LSD intake to anyone. He's proudly flaunting it.
Well, he's actually exaggerating it, if anything, 1,000 trips.
I doubt he went on hundreds of trips. I don't think you can survive hundreds of trips.
Yeah, I would, if I had to guess, probably, 200 maybe. Because I think he was doing it, it wouldn't be every day, because obviously you've got lots of recording and everything. They were still fairly busy. But you feel like, but you and I have talked about this plenty of times, at the Sgt. Pepper party, he just looks like a, even Ray Coleman said, he looked, haggard, old and ill.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. It opened up the portals. And of course, people have speculated for years about Lewis Carroll and said, well, in a funny way, he was writing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds in 1865, but apparently, I don't know if you heard this story, if this is true, that apparently he used to get migraines. And there's some belief that sometimes if you get a very, very severe migraine, it opens up some sort of portal. That's by no means settled science, but...
Well, there's all sorts. Graham Gouldman from 10cc says when he's writing, he can see colours. I don't know how the mind can do that, but apparently some people can see colours for chords. This is a very green chord, or this is a very yellow chord, or...
Yeah.
You're a musician.
Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen colours, but, there's definitely different states. Actually, when I was in Madrid, I went through a period of quite bad insomnia, and I remember talking about this to one of the musicians. I used to, get to bed at like 1 o'clock, and then I'd wake up at 5, feeling both very tired and fully awake at the same time. And the weird thing about it was that I would have good ideas for English lessons, for music, for writing, and there's always a dilemma. Do I try and go back to sleep because I'm going to be a bit of a mess the next day, or do I make the most of this? And after a while, I decided, for the next hour, I'm going to write down ideas, because they were all coming to me, 5 o'clock in the morning. So all kinds of things can trigger it, I think.
Yeah, no, that's true. Cynthia said that one time she noticed Lennon couldn't come back to bed, and he came back with the lyrics for Across the Universe.
Absolutely, yeah. They'd had some sort of row, or he woke up and literally words were flowing out. He literally wrote what was happening. Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup.
Such a gorgeous lyric.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Isn't it? Even he said that one stands as a lyric. So is there anything that when you're writing, is there anything that inspires you? Is there any state that inspires you? I don't know.
I've written some poems over time. I think there's that age-old thing of art is pain that, you channel when you're in this like real agonized state of pain, like emotional pain from bereavement, or often your work stands up for its honesty much more than if you've fallen in love with someone and you're writing about the daffodils growing in the garden and the two suns in the sky, dancing together. But I haven't really written in that sort of like offbeat Lennon-esque style.
Yeah, but I would say definitely. It's become a bit of a cliche that pain creates art, but I think it does. Not always directly, but in some way it gives you something to write about that does cut deep, as you said.
The McCartney's first album where, his two best mates, John and George, have abandoned him. He's drinking. He doesn't know what he's doing with his life. There's a track where it's just him on a drum, just beating the crap out of it, Mama Miss America. And I really rate the first McCartney album.
No, I love it. Yeah, I love it. I love the guitar as well because it's not perfect. It's like, which is the David Bowie album he did all the guitar? Can't remember. One of those early 70s. If you listen back to it, it's not as good as Mick Ronson, clearly, but it's great in its imperfection. And if you listen to like Maybe I'm Amazed, there's guitar lines.
Diamond Dogs.
Oh, is it Diamond Dogs? Right. Yeah. And then, Maybe I'm Amazed. That guitar, a guitarist could look at that and say, well, that's not perfect, but that's the whole point almost. It sounds really, really raw,
And what a confession of love to Linda, maybe I'm amazed at the way you love me all the time. I don't deserve you.
Yeah, no, that's a cool album. I've always liked that. Okay, so I'll just with in his own right, rather than read the stories, I'll just give you a few examples here. So there's one called No Flies on Frank. Though I walk through the valley of thy shadowy hut, which is a sort of a take on a biblical quote, a beauty queer. And then he kills his wife in the story, and then his wife is covered in flies, obviously, because it's a dead body, and he delivers the body to his mother-in-law. It's very, very dark, but when I was reading it, I was thinking he's kind of showing us in a strange way what goes on under the sort of facade of normal life, of everybody trying to get on with it. And then you just got pure comedy, the famous five. I've got to remember that there's going to be a lot of people listening from overseas who wouldn't have heard of these. So he says, the famous five, and then he names like 10 of them. And then he calls them the fabled five. And then he says, anything you say may be used in Everton. So there's a little reference there. Yeah. And then there's an interesting one called Scene 3, Act 1. And he talks about a coloured woman singing a coloured song. And then it's all about a worker who's outraged at his capitalist boss. There's a lot of stuff in the books about workers and capitalists. But then the worker is more disgusted at this coloured woman being there. So he completely forgets how enraged he is at the evil capitalist. So he's putting this in, and like I said to you earlier, there's no way I don't think that John Lennon was racist himself. It's social commentary.
It's like someone saying to Mark Lewisohn, was Paul McCartney anti-Semitic? And Lewisohn says, 2 of his 3 wives were Jewish,
Yeah. Like I said, I think it's just commenting that it's there. And then, again, some great stuff. Treasure Ivan, it's obviously a take on Treasure Island. Large John Saliva, The Parable on Your Shoulder, Arrested for Development, which is an interesting idea. Ooh. Panorasma, which is to do with panorama. And then Wrinkled Dinglebone, which I'm pretty sure is Richard Dimbleby, who was a broadcaster of that time. I think I mentioned earlier Harris Macmillan and Priceless Margarine. And then we get some drug references, Neville Club, Smoking Hernia, Taking Odeon, Rampling or Dancing with Wild Abdomen, Indian Hump. And then he said, they seemed Olivier to the world around them. I love it. The Early Owls of the Morecambe. And Morecambe is actually a northern city. That's Eric Morecambe's. He was named after, because his real name wasn't Morecambe. Unhappy Frank. A lot of the stuff in the books is violent, isn't it?
Mm, yeah.
And again, I see it as this, I was listening to a podcast about The Shining, one of the many, but this was like a 4-hour deep dive. And someone had come up with the idea that The Shining was showing the kind of murderousness that hides under every family. So I think John Lennon's showing us what's underneath.
He was a brawler. He used to get into bar fights with him and Stu, and as Richard Buskin said on an Oasis podcast, Liam Gallagher said he wanted to kick the shit out of George Harrison, and Buskin said, "These are hard lads. Like, you're not going to beat the shit out of George Harrison."
No, they were, definitely. I can't remember a specific example. There's a lot of stuff of like people living normal lives, like a guy going to the office every day, and you can see that it's sort of killing him. You know that Radiohead lyric, "A job that slowly kills you."
Yeah.
Wounds that won't heal. It's that kind of idea. The working man, I think nowadays people tend to try and get jobs that reflect their interests. I think in those days, you had your working life and then you had your real life almost, the work-life balance. I always find that funny. They call it a work-life balance, which means that your work has nothing to do with your life. But anyway.
Yeah, it's especially prevalent in England, I think. I mean, I think some countries like France and Spain, they're better at kind of bringing these two things together.
Absolutely. Well, then you got the Pink Floyd, hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way.
Well played.
Dark Side of the Moon, isn't it? Yeah, one of those songs. And you mentioned Python earlier. I mean, there is a kind of a through line from the Goons to Richard Lester to John Lennon's books to How I Won the War to Python. And it's all about how the facade of, let's say, English life, because they were talking specifically about England in those days. Under the surface, there's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah. George Harrison said that he felt the spirit of the Beatles was continued by Python.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because they started in '69, didn't they? Yeah, I love that quote. Before we move on, can we talk about the drawings in the book? Because like I say, I always tend to think of the writing. How would we characterize those?
I don't think drawing was necessarily a second calling for him, but there's character to them. And I think he gets that slightly detached, satirical viewpoint across quite well. What do you think?
Well, let me... I'm just going to show you this. I'm going to show you to the camera.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that crude caricature.
I'll describe this in a second, but go on, yeah, tell me.
I've seen some of Klaus Vormann's paintings, and they're I told this to Pete Best. I said he was incredible, and Pete was like... unbelievable, like beyond, like, I mean, this guy had a talent way beyond his years.
Klaus Vormann or Stu?
Stu. Oh, Klaus also is exceptional.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, John Lennon was clearly, I used to go to school with a couple of guys. They're very good at cartoons and caricatures. I think that was John Lennon. Again, I'll show you this picture. It's a great one.
Yeah, it's pretty mad.
Yeah, I'll try and describe this picture. I mean, this is the one with the drug references, smoking hernia and everything. Generally, there's a lot of people with sort of elongated features. He also has, have like very tiny people and very enormous, which is very Alice again. She drinks the potion, she's 10 feet tall, and then she's tiny. There's a lot of that. There's quite a lot of there's a lot of grotesque. There's a lot of people with like hairy warts on their face and all that kind of thing. And there's endless references to warts and things like that. And it's very strange. But I think he had a talent, a sort of cartoon. I mean, look at this one. Let me just show you. Look at that one there.
I know.
This guy's head is...
the disjointed neck.
Yeah. And there's another one. What is it? I'm very attached to my dog. And the man's neck or his head is literally attached to the tail of the dog. It's in one of the other books. I mean, I think it's fantastic. But it's just reflecting this kind of grotesque, warped or twisted view of the world. And then it ends with I Remember Arnold, which is reminiscing. So that was a good way to end.
When he first came to the first run-through with actors doing it in the rehearsal room, at the end of it, when they'd finished, I turned and looked at John. John was crying. And I thought, my God, is it that bad? And I said, what's the matter? And he said, oh, Vic, you made me think of all the things I was to think about when I was 16. And I said, that's the review. No matter what the critics are going to say, that's it. Because he suddenly could see at those poems, that was the first time, the beginning of any awareness he'd put down in these poems. I saw it as that. I saw it as he always said, the influence is upon us, that's it. Because we have one's first impression of going to the theatre, watching television, going to the cinema, the first book we read, the first date we might have. So all that is in your work. Is it? He said. I said, yes, it's all there. You've actually written your autobiography. It's you and the things that happened to you. But it's written in that, if you like, it's a surrealistic way. Or maybe even disguised way. He didn't know. When he said, You remind me of all the things I was thinking when I was 16. This was the one that came into my mind about these kids he played with. I remember Arnold. I remember Khaki Hargreaves, as if it were yestermorn. Khaki Hargreaves, son of Mr. Vaughan. He used to be so grunty on him little bike, riding on a Sunday, funny little tyke. Yeah. I remember Cathy Abream, as if 'twere yesterday. Cathy Abream, son of Mr. May. Arriving at the station, always dead on time for his destination. Now he's dead online, meaning he's been got by a train or something. And so we grout and bumbly till the end of time. Humpty Dumpty Bumbly, son of Harry Lime.
Anyway, let's get to Spaniard of the Works. So as we said, this is quite a different animal because I think he kind of said he'd run out of material, so it was written from scratch. He famously said, "Oh, give me a bottle of whiskey." He went into a room and made it up. Now, do you think it benefits from that?
I think so. I think there's one thing I will give it. It's more cohesive. It flows better than in his own right. In his own right, it is a compilation of vignettes, as we said, whereas Spaniard, there's more of a narrative flow to it, even if it isn't entirely narrative.
Yeah, they're longer. I mean, there's one that's 9 pages, which is the longest of possibly the 3 books, definitely the first 2. We'll talk about Skywriting. I feel like that's a kind of a different animal, isn't it? Because that's also a compilation that came out after he died. But apparently in 1964, John and George went to Tahiti with Cynthia and Patty. And George Harrison actually complained in his diary. He said, "John's always bloody reading." John apparently was reading the complete Sherlock Holmes. And then he was also writing as well. And again, apparently George, Cyn and Patty contributed a few lines or a few words here and there. One of the reviews said, "More warped than its predecessor," which is quite a compliment.
Well, no, George was not someone to hide his opinion. There's that tale that Mccartney says we need to get some... They're in India, and they're supposed to be meditating. And Mccartney says we need to do some writing. "We're not here to write, we're here to meditate."
Yeah, we're not here to write the next fucking album. Yeah. Making a general comment, I think with this one and the 3rd book, I prefer the wordplay to the stories. I mean, there's a couple of stories that have some interesting endings, I must say. There's one I'll get to in a minute, but I think I was just reveling in the wordplay, basically. I wasn't really too focused on what was going to happen at the end of these stories. I don't know. What do you reckon?
I'm going to name drop here. 2 years ago, I interviewed Andy Partridge from Ecstasy, and it was the Apple Venus album, which he described as acoustic, so orchestral acoustic. And I said, "Where do you get these wordplays from?" He said, and he actually mentioned from stuff like In His Own Right and Spaniard in the Works. He mentioned that Dylan tried to write a book in that sort of vein, and he thought, "I've never read such third-rate Burroughs, it was crap."
Oh, is that Tarantula?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to mention, if you look at some of Dylan's mid-60s albums, obviously the music is stellar, but some of the liner notes are very, very difficult to read. And I was feeling that a bit with the 3rd book here, but I kind of got into it still. Sometimes that stream of consciousness, if it goes on for just pages and pages, you have to kind of be in the mood for it, I think. I don't know. This one sold a bit less, 100,000 copies at the time. Have you got a couple from this book?
Yeah. A man travelling on a train, like you or I, to Scotland had two or two bad eggs in his pocket, and no one would sit by him.
Now, what does that mean? What's the hidden meanings there?
Like a bad egg is, a bad person in society, so, a bad egg with 2 bad eggs in his pockets. There's sort of an undercurrent there.
Yeah, there's loads of double meanings in this. I noticed that. One of my favourite... I'm going to read this. Now, if you're easily offended, ladies and gentlemen, go forward a little bit, but I'm going to read this as it's written, and I'm making the point that this is not what John Lennon thinks, but I think he's making a comment on society. So this is called... Well, this is a Spaniard in the Works, and the main character, Jesus El Pifco. Jesus El Pifco was a foreigner, and he knew it. Which again is making the comment that someone in a foreign country, they're being reminded every day that they're a foreigner. That's what I get from it. And then this is the bit where he's not holding back. Being a good Catholic, Jesus wiped the spit from his face and turned the other cheese. But she had gone, leaving him once more in an Agatha of Christie. Of course, the horse didn't answer because, as you know, they cannot speak, least of all to a garlic-eating, stinking little yellow, greasy, fascist bastard, Catholic Spaniard. Pretty hard-hitting. They soon made it up, howevens, and Jesus and wee spastic were once morphia unitely in a love that knew no Susie. etc.
I'm reminded of, there's an extended version of Get Back, which McCartney sings, that's a lot more cutting, like about joining the fascist party, and some people who heard the bootlegs thought that the Beatles were, advocating right-wing fascism, not realising it's out-and-out parody.
Yeah. Well, that went through lots of things, didn't it? It was Negro in Reserve, and then it was Pakistanis living in a council flat. And then there's a nice bit of cod Spanish. This is obviously a kinship for us. Parece, this doesn't mean anything, by the way. Parece el pino estrevero que bueno el franco senatro.
Oh, Jesus.
Which rugby transplanted means only if you've got green braces. Unfortunately, she had. Not sure what that means, but anyway.
It's like that bit of Here Comes the Sun Cream, Here Comes the Sun King. As you know, they're doing this sort of gibberish. Ando, mi amor.
Here comes the sun cream. You're getting in the spirit. Here comes the sun cream.
Yeah, but they're going into this nonsensical kind of Spanish thing. Cuanto baremito.
Yeah, cake and eat it. That's my favourite one. I love that. Because it's care like care what in Spanish, but then cake and eat it as well. Oh, it's great stuff. Snore wife and some several dwarfs. It sounds better with the mock Beatles accent, I feel like.
I agree.
And then Shamrock, the story that I was talking about earlier was Shamrock Worms. This is brilliant. You know the famous quote is elementary, my dear Watson. Ella Fitzgerald, my dear Whopper. And then he goes from Ella Fitzgerald to Harry Belafonte, another singer. Elephantitis, my dear Whopper, which again is the deformities. Ali Baba, Alec Guinness. And then it goes, Alec Guinness, my deaf Whopper. It's a weird story of Sherlock Holmes investigating Jack the Ripper. So you've got Jack the Nipple, Jock the Cripple, Buckinghall Parcel, and then he says, I'm Delaware of your name, etc. So it's just puns galore, isn't it, really?
John's humour was great, and it was always a little bit bizarre, and people know his books. He loved playing with words, and he loved the punishment, if you like. Ella Fitzgerald, my dear Whopper, those kind of things.
Ella Fitzgerald, my dear Whopper. He grimaced. Then sharply, guess whom has broken out of jail, Whopper? My mind immediately recoughed all the caramels that had recently escaped from wormy scabs. Eric Morley, I ventured. He shook his bed. Oxo Whitney, I queered. He knotted in the infirmary. Rigo Hargreaves, I Winston agreeably. No, my dear Whopper, it's Oxo Whitney. He bellowed as if I was in another room, and I wasn't. How do you know, Wooms? I whispered discreetly. Harry Belafonte, my dear Whopper. At that precise moment, a tall, rather angular, tall, thin man knocked on the door. By all accounts, that must be he, Whopper. I marvelled at his acute Osbert Lancaster. How on earth do you know, Wooms? I asked, revealing my bad armchair. Elephantitis, my deaf Whopper. He baggaged, knocking out his pip on his large leather leg.
Have you got any other ones there? Do you want to read anything else?
Yeah, I've got this one. Adam in a ditch was always laughing. She woof laugh at these, laugh at that. Always laughing she was. Many body people woof look at her saying, why does Aram in a ditch keep laughing? They could never understand why she was never laughing about the place. So understamp, not understand. I hope she's not laughing at me, some peakle would say. I certainly hope that Araminta Ditch is not laughing at me.
Yeah, I've got some stuff from there as well. Sam Ting had Toby Doon, an elderly passenger who travelled regular on that roof and had a right to know. And I talk about getting on a bus, obviously a bus. But what's interesting there is that there's a couple of references in the books to priests or religious figures not having the answers. So she goes to a priest to discover why she can't stop laughing. And the priest says, what can I do? And in the end, she dies laughing, partly from laughing at the fact that her neighbours died before her. Dark stuff. And then we've got this brilliant drawing. I am blind. Two people with guide dogs. One says, I am blind, and the other one says, I can see quite clearly. And the blind man's dog has got dark glasses on. So, I don't know exactly what that means. But and then you've got Last Will and Testicle. And I wanted to tell you about this one because this is really interesting. So You know the idea of somebody having a trust fund. They can't get the money until they're 18 or 21 or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, this one has a kind of a twist. A girl's uncle dies, but every clown has a silver lifeboat. So the niece gets left some money, but this time instead of the money being kept, the niece is kept in a box until she's 21. People come to see her and there's a microphone inside and a speaker. But then her grandma, old Nanny, when she goes on holiday, she turns the speaker off. So there's a lot of stuff in the books as well about people not caring about other people, that kind of thing. I don't know if you're much of a fan of the Velvet Underground, but you know the song called The Gift?
Oh, yeah. That's a college essay Lou Reed wrote and John Cale reads out.
That's it. So they've got like a groove going in the background and John Cale's reading the story. And it's basically a lovesick guy who's in a long-distance relationship decides to post himself to his girlfriend. And when his girlfriend gets the box, she can't open it. So she takes a knife and stabs through the middle of it, obviously killing him.
Yeah.
And interestingly here, the box that the niece is in, it gets too near to the fire and the box goes on fire and she burns to death. It's dark. No two ways about it. Yeah.
I mean, Walk on the Wild Side, I mean, is full of hidden meanings, like he was a she and she said, which I don't think you could get away with nowadays, to be so blatantly.
Yeah, that's kind of what I love about that period, you know, because I don't really keep up nowadays. I'm still, my favourite music is still always 60s and 70s, basically. You know, I still listen to other stuff, but...
I know that John Cleese from Monty Python was quite upset when Netflix removed the episode with the generals, using fairly unsavoury language about, black British people or, immigrants. It was a different time.
Yeah, and you've got to think of the intention as well. I still maintain we shouldn't be afraid of words. Words could mean anything, you know. I'm afraid of a world where we just have to pause every time we open our mouths, you know. And then just the last, later on in the book, there's another against a black man saying, why does Griff bring so much misery in the world? Griff being God. And the reply from the clergyman is chapter 8, verse 5, page 9. And all that comes of it in the end, they end up kissing and clasping hands and the Reverend offers forgiveness. You know, there's no context. It's just like, but it's the idea that, you know, again, I'm not anti-religion per se, but the idea that he's saying that, you know, they don't have the answer. They just quote like a Bible verse.
Yeah, of course.
All right. And then we get the third book, which, like I say, quite different because it actually came out in 86, obviously posthumously. It was written and drawn between 68 and 79. There's quite a lot of autobiography at the beginning, which is not even it's not even written in this veiled language. It's pretty much straight autobiography. And then we get these, once again, quote unquote nonsense stories, but there's quite a lot of him in them. Yeah, there's little bits of his story. There's even a story with the character Sean. Well, this is before Sean Lennon was born, but it's Sean. Oh, no, it wasn't actually. It was after. But John is Sean in this, basically. What's your general opinion of Skywriting by word of mouth?
Yeah, I don't think you can compare it. I mean, he's a very different person, let alone a different writer. Everyone says the George that came back from India was not the George that went to India. I don't think the John that came back from India was the same John. I mean, by that stage, you know, his mind was determined on Yoko. He wanted to follow ellipsism, which is a fancy way of saying art had to be very honest. So he's gone from 15 months earlier writing, you know, A Day in the Life and Lucy in the Sky to, you know, to writing stuff that is much more hard-hitting like Julia, or he's about to write Cold Turkey, and, you know, if it's not honest, it's not getting on the album. It seems to be his way for the next few years. He's not veiling anything anymore. There's none of this boy where, you know, he's writing about someone else, but of course it's him, no, I'm writing about me, because I only know me.
Yeah, exactly. And of course he name checks Yoko in the songs, and he name checks her. He says I. Well, he even says John, doesn't he, on the song God? I was a walrus, now I'm John.
Hold on, John.
Hold on, John. Yeah, he's singing to himself, basically, yeah. And there's a nice bit from this book. He talks about he loved Brigitte Bardot when he was a teenager. Met the real Bridget a few years later. I was on acid and she was on her way out. And then he says, I finally met Yoko.
I finally met Yoko and the dream became a reality. The only woman I'd ever met who was my equal in every way imaginable. My better, actually. Although I'd had numerous interesting affairs in my previous incarnation, I'd never met anyone worth breaking up a happily married state of boredom for.
Now, there's a kinship with the other books, because, as I said, he was talking about married life and that beneath the surface there's all kinds going on. Escape at last,
Escape at
someone
last.
to leave home for.
Someone to leave
go,
home
and
for.
yours is an eternity.
Somewhere to go. I'd waited an eternity.
So that was quite nice.
Yeah, well, not nice for Cynthia.
Of course, yeah, no, I'm saying it's...
I know. But on the very first episode I was on, we looked at the Maureen Cleave interview, and even there it's suggested that, you know, he can't wait to get out of Surrey, and even though he's made this his home, it's not going to contain him. Both Maureen and John have realised that.
Yeah, what's the quote? This is not what I'm supposed to be doing or something, you know. Yeah. He was waiting for something to come along. And the other one, this is actually on the Christmas 69 Beatles flexi disc, you know, the fan club disc. Once upon a time, there were two balloons called Jock and Yono. They were strictly in love, bound to happen in a million years.
These, I assume, are the other three Beatles.
Yeah, the Beast, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And in fact, he makes a sort of sarcastic, talks about the Beatles as avant-garde revolutionary thinkers, but he actually means it sarcastically in some of the stories. So, I mean, it's quite bitter, I've got to say. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, perhaps, you know, with some justification. He talks about the racism of the English press. Yeah. He thanks Jesus for them stopping touring. Yeah, if he hadn't said they were bigger than Jesus, they wouldn't have stopped touring, probably. There's some interesting stuff about, he says that artists don't owe a debt to the public. And again, this is quite a debate that's always going on. And, you know, George said in the early days, you know, if you eat cornflakes, that doesn't mean Mr. Kellogg owes you his life. Yeah. You know, it's the artist isn't in the debt just because someone's bought their record.
If you read the Jan Wenner quote or listen to the tapes, he's all about him being an artist, and there's that wonderful line, I'm an artist, give me a trumpet, I'm going to make it.
Yeah, give me a tuba.
That's it, give me a tuba.
Yeah, we had a question about that in the last show. A bit more wordplay. Al Crap, which is a reference to Al Cap, had the famous confrontation at the bed-in. Two mixed don't make a wasp, and that's wasp as in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Life doesn't imitate art, life is art. And then he's quite rough on when he was going through his revolutionary period. He talks about the Cambridge School of Revolutionaries, which I think is to do with Tariq Ali and Robin Blackburn. Mm-hmm. He has a dig at Hunter S. Thompson. Apparently John Sinclair tried to sue him, according to this. And then he said, all in all, we had a few laughs and lots of drugs. Talks about meditation. There's just all sorts. Quite different. And then I just wrote a load of notes. I mean, it's just hundreds and hundreds of examples of quite funny wordplay.
One that actually I found quite interesting is he says that the Beatles thing wasn't as important to some of the points of his life and less than others.
He was always veering, wasn't he? You know, between, they were important, Paul was my best friend, and Paul wasn't that important. Nothing happened before Yoko. He's always oscillating. And even in 1980, I mean, you'll know very well, we've been covering that ad nauseum.
What's interesting about John was he's the only one, and I read this in the Peter Doggett book, Paul and George make it very clear we're not Beatles, I've got Wings, I've got Ravi Shankar, whatever. John's still describing himself as a Beatle in interviews with like a whispering...
Bob Harris.
Thank you, whispering Bob Harris. He's still referring to himself as a Beatle. We're just, like, there's none of this, I was a Beatle. It's, I'm a Beatle, I'm just doing my own thing.
Wow, that's interesting, yeah. Because there's always that misconception that, I think I've talked about this, I think I did it in the last show, but that Paul was always the one that needed the most. And I think that's kind of been debunked. Paul was the one who was saying, the thing is over, let's sign a piece of paper, Yeah. I still say it's an eternal mystery, we're never really going to know what was going on behind closed doors. But
as George Harrison said to Mark Lewisohn, how would you know you weren't there? Yeah, apparently Harrison absolutely despised Lewisohn.
Yeah, I know. I love listening to Mark Lewisohn. I was listening to him talking about the books, and there's a channel actually on YouTube that's not put together by him, but someone's made a compilation. Yeah.
I know the Nothing Is Real guys were a bit upset with... I'm mates with them, with Jason and Stephen, and they weren't too happy with that their episode had been put on by unofficially.
It's a good episode, though.
Superb episode.
I think Mark's fantastic, like both writer and interviewee, sorry. If you don't mind, I'm just going to give a few examples of these wordplay, because I think this is great. Martha's Graveyard, which is a reference to Martha's Vineyard, which is where Jaws was filmed. And this is an interesting thing where... I don't know what the intention is, but if you think of, those places where very rich people go to retire, like Florida and Martha's Vineyard's kind of one of those. It's very exclusive. So he could, be making a comment about when you retire, you may as well be in the graveyard. I don't know. That's me reading into it. But like we were saying at the top of the show, I think once the art is out there, I don't think the artists themselves have the exclusive rights to what it means. We can attach our own meanings, and any meaning is valid.
Yeah.
There's loads of other stuff. This is all completely random, by the way. I'm just taking little bits. Pass the entrance exam with flying hormones.
What does that even mean?
Well, that's the thing. It's just wordplay. I don't know what it means. I mean, flying hormones. Young people always got flying hormones, haven't they? Hans had been slowly suffering from incompetence for most of his adult life. This one I really love. The world stage was soon to open with a revival of World War I. It was to be known as World War II. But that's interesting because a lot of historians, revisionists if you want to call them that, have said that it was because of the treaty after World War I was one of the reasons that World War II happened, because Germany went into hyperinflation, etc., etc. And there's no doubt to me that John Lennon read a lot and had his finger on the pulse. And I think with his sort of alternative slant on the world, I think he would have been very much at home nowadays, with alternative media, definitely.
That's it. When McCartney first met Lennon, he found the Autobiography of Winston Churchill, and Lennon, being only 15 or 16, had already read it, which, is impressive for someone of that age.
That's the thing. He had Just William on the one hand, and, like you said, Lewis Carroll, the Alice books. A lot of credit goes to the uncle, because if you learn to reading the local paper, that's a lot different than, just ABC and everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're going to have that literary side to you. Some other ones. At the age of 12, he entered an ashram head first, where for the next 20 years he practiced meditation, intense discipline and bondage. He tried to consult the stars, but no one returned his calls. He's quite hard on meditation in this book, I must say. And I think quite a lot of it might have been written in 79, because there's quite a few cartoons that say John Lennon 79 on them.
Well, he never seemed to recover from the fracas with the Maharishi. As McCartney says in the Barry Miles book, I didn't find it too bad, but John and George thought he was, a demigod or whatever, but he's just a guy. He likes girls, so what?
Yeah. Well, I think George had continued to believe in him for the rest of his life, I think.
Probably, yeah. Why not? Yeah. But Lennon took it really, really badly.
That's the thing. I mean, he had these very strong reactions. He's one of those people, I believe, that would just throw everything into one thing, one person. Maharishi, Yoko, Arthur Yanoff, whoever it was.
Or McCartney on How Do You Sleep?
Yeah, there you go, yeah. John Lennon was almost practicing cancel culture 50 years before it was even a thing, I think he was just basically an all-or-nothing person, it seemed. And whether that would have changed as he hit 50 or 60, who knows? He tried to shake the depression he'd been carrying around in a briefcase for the last 30 years. Which again could be a reference to, a businessman doing a job he hates, quietly depressed, etc. I was educated at the London School of Depression. I had suicidal tendencies, but luckily had them removed at age 13. I never knew my parents. I could never get an interview with them. Anyway, you get the idea. And then group therapy is grope therapy. And then primal therapy says, I myself had been to primitive therapy, which took me 6 months to find out the doctor was crazy. Anyway, I could go on, but you get the idea, It's I loved it. I just think it's great wordplay.
Had he intended for them to be published?
We don't know. I think most of it was in his diaries. The later stuff, the stuff that says 79, I think was in his famous diary that everybody seems to have either owned or stolen or written about.
I wasn't too comfortable when Yoko applied for co-writing credit on Imagine in John's absence, so maybe this might be another... I don't know, I mean, if he'd intended for it, then...
I mean, he mentioned it, didn't he? He said it should have been Lennon Ono. Again, he's kind of an unreliable witness, isn't he? Because depending on what mood he's in, he could give you any kind of answer.
For sure, yeah. In the Wenner interview, he goes from saying, Paul and I never wrote together to, well, by Sgt. Pepper, Paul and I were writing better than ever, and that's in 10 minutes.
He even went back on that interview 4 years later, I think, so difficult. All right, let's try and find a conclusion here. So what can a person learn from reading these books? Is it just nonsense, deep meanings? What do you reckon?
I think they're just a reflection of his artistry. I mean, we forgot to mention that In His Own Right was the very first solo project of any Beatle.
Of course, yeah.
I like to see them as their own thing. I don't want to say, they pinpointed to Sgt. Pepper or the White Album. I like to see them as what they are. I think in his own right is wonderfully Milligan-esque. Spaniard in the Work is, a good continuation. And maybe if he'd had a third volume in 66, 67, we might have had a nice trilogy. I don't see this as a trilogy, as we said, because the third one is so detached and he's a different person, different stage. I think Skywriting it reminds me of the very last Tintin novel, the one that Hergé never completed. So it's a fascinating look at an artist in isolation, I suppose.
No, it's a good choice of words, because he was in isolation, depending what you believe. Yeah.
Yeah, the first two are like sharp, Python-esque, Milligan-esque pieces of probably postmodernism.
Yeah, it's interesting how for the Beatles and for John Lennon, 65 followed 64 in the sense that you got, another film, and then you got another book, and then you nearly got that third book. He was considering it, apparently, but in the same way we never got the third Beatles film. I mean, okay, we got the ones later on, but again, they're almost like different animals, really.
Yeah. What's slightly frustrating about Lennon is that he seemed to show a precocity for something, but never kind of delivered on it. Whereas, say, some of the others, they either recognize their strengths and polish it, like Harrison did with, say, slide guitar, or you've got the opposite with McCartney, who realizes he's not an actor on that really awful Broad Street film and just abandons it there and then. But with Lennon, sometimes it's neither fish nor fowl. He dips his hand at something but doesn't kind of see it through to its logical conclusion.
No, I agree. I think in the end, though, in the Fred Seaman book, he talks about there was this John Lennon who was just hanging around the Dakota and didn't know what to do with himself. And then when he got the inspiration, I mean, we know Double Fantasy wasn't all written in one go. We know that now. But even so, I think when he was in Bermuda in the summer of 1980, he got inspired in some way. And then he said, then the real John Lennon appeared. But I think reading was one consistent thing. We all need some consistency in our lives, I think. And I think reading and books, learning was John Lennon's thing his whole life, and obviously songwriting. So one thing I wanted to ask you, do you think had he lived, we would have ever got a novel? And would you like to speculate, complete speculation, what he might have written about if he'd actually gone for a full-length novel?
Oh, God, speculation. It's a tough one.
I sprung that one on you.
It's possible. It's quite possible that instead of Skywriting, we'd have had the full-blown novel, something in that ilk. I don't really know about conjectures. Like people say, he may have come back and had this reunion in the mid-90s and been like the ultimate Britpop star and, recorded with Liam Gallagher or whatever. Oh, that gives me hives, actually. I don't want to think of that.
Kurt Cobain would have been better.
I think they'd definitely, John and Paul would definitely have written together again. Would it have been as good? Probably not.
I don't think there would have been like a partnership for any sustained length of time, but it would have been nice, yeah. Some songs. I was trying to think about this. We know he had a sort of a short attention span, but I think as he aged, you could perhaps say that pop stars have a certain arrested development. So when they're 40, in some ways they still have the mentality of someone who's 25 or whatever. But I think as he got older, I could imagine some sort of novel about the sea, perhaps. Some mixture of Alfred Lennon and John himself. And I don't think he would write it in the first person. It would be some character that would be about him. And I feel like it might be about freedom or trying to find freedom.
Yeah.
Because I think that was one of his eternal struggles.
Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting. Around that time, Pete Townsend had gone into book publishing, so there was precedence for it. And Pete Townsend was encouraged to generate sales to name his character Pete. But then he said, my character fucks a horse, and I don't know if I want people to think I did that. I mean, Pete has a dodgy internet history as is.
Yes. Yeah, horse fucking, that doesn't go on well. Maybe John Lennon could have, I don't know, got a publisher that he connected with, and he could have guided him through it, like a producer guiding him through an album. It's a nice thought. It's one of those things I think about, and I think, I would definitely read that.
I'd like to think he and George would have said, okay, come on, I mean mine, okay, I'd have preferred if you'd, acknowledge this and this, but whatever, we're mates. But they never had that chance.
Well, Ghostly on the last show was saying that he thinks they would have buried the hatchet. We amplify these things. He mentions it once in an interview in 1980, and because he died, we don't have him refuting it, so who knows? Ghosty also made the point that I think John was mentioned more than Paul in Naomi Mai. Before you go, can you tell us what you've got going on at the moment?
Okay. I did an interview with Colin Moulding of Ecstasy a week ago. I have to transcribe that tonight. Just actually today, during this interview, Far Out published my interview with Will Sargent from Echo and the Bunnymen. So that's on farout.co.uk. I'm working on a book on George Harrison. It's called George Harrison in the 70s, same guys as the U2 book, Sonic Bond Publishing. So it'll look from, say, All Things Must Pass until Life of Brian.
Oh, so you're going to be including the handmade stuff?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay, it'll just touch on, it'll just be Life of Brian and Long Good Friday and a couple more in the appendix. But I think the meat of the book will be on the Dark Horse period, which it's sort of a turning point for him. You know, he's had his marital breakdown, the coke is going up his nose, he's having an internal conflict between, you know, the spiritual and, you know, rock and roll, and he just can't get it into his head that audiences in America don't want to listen to, you know, this spiritual music, they want the hits. So he's having to reconcile. Whereas McCartney found it very easy to do, all right lads, come on.
Yeah, and on the subject of George, we finally got a George Harrison podcast. I like to think I might have been at least partly responsible because I mentioned it a few times on here and said, come on, someone. Yeah. We've got young Hudson, all of 13. Is he 13? Maybe he's 14 now. Sorry, Hudson.
No, it's up to pressing.
And the aforementioned Marv, who's got pods like us. So they've stepped up.
Yeah, the Nothing Is Real guys have done an episode in Dark Horse that's coming out soon.
Oh, have they? Right, yeah.
Stephen Cockcroft is a real George is his Beatle.
Cool. All right. Well, as I always say, good luck with everything and stay on the line for a sec. And thanks for being on the show.
Ta-ra.
Goodbye.
So there you have it. That was episode 72. Finally, 2-month wait. Can you believe that? The longest wait in the history of Glass Onion. Anyway, good news is that I do have some more recordings to go, and I'm actually going to clear my backlog across my 3 podcasts by the end of the year for sure. So there should be a bumper crop. So anyway, hope the wait was worth it and you enjoyed that talk about the John Lennon books. It was a wonderful experience. As I was saying to Owen, I read the 3 in quick succession, and then that kind of led me to the audiobook of the John Lennon letters, the Hunter Davies book. And the audiobook has Christopher Eccleston using his Lennon naked Scouse accent to read some of John Lennon's amazing letters. And if you thought there were a lot of puns in the books, those letters are just puns galore. Before I go, a couple more things. If you'd like to make a donation to the show, the email address glassonionpod@yahoo.com, that works for a PayPal donation. Or indeed, if you wanted to leave feedback as well, that's the email address. Had a couple of donors? What's the word? Donors sounds more like organs. If you'd like to donate some internal organs to Glass Onion on John Lennon, the usual email address. But seriously, yes, if you'd like to help out the show, that would be very much appreciated. The next show is with a young man called Gaz Keenan, who heads the band John Lennon Tribute UK, and he is, let's get the right word, a John Lennon tribute artist. So we had a nice discussion back in about 1948. No, it's back in August, I think. So that'll be the next show. As I said, lots of others coming soon. So Glass Onion is still here, in case you're wondering. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you soon for the next episode. All the best, and goodbye.